In 58 BC, a Roman legion marched through Gaul, and the thing each soldier never dared leave behind was not his sword, but his shovel. Each man carried nearly 30 kilograms on his shoulders, walking day after day across foreign land. They did not know where the next battle would be, but they knew one thing for certain. Tonight, they would have to dig. This story is not about resumed dying battles. It is about the problem of transport, excavation, and organization, the thing that quietly transformed Rome from a city-state on the banks of the Tiber into an empire spanning 3 continents. If you ask why Rome won battle after battle, most people will answer immediately. The testudo formation like a tortoise shell, iron discipline, and genius generals like Caesar. It sounds very convincing. But archaeology tells a different story. At Roman military sites in England, Germany, and Israel, the most commonly excavated items among soldiers' equipment are not weapons. They are digging tools. The dalabra, which was both a pickaxe and an axe, shovels, woven baskets for carrying earth, and wooden stakes carried by each man. An army that conquered the world, yet the trove of artifacts it left behind, looks more like a construction site than a battlefield. Here is a hard truth to swallow. Rome did not win because it fought better. Gallic and Germanic warriors were taller, no less skilled in battle, and in many engagements they vastly outnumbered the Romans. Rome won because it solved a problem no opponent could solve: how to keep 5,000 people well-fed, sleeping safely, moving 25 to 30 kilometers a day, continuously for months, thousands of kilometers from home. To understand how difficult that problem was, look at the technological limits of the era. No refrigerators, no telegraphs, no engines. The staple food was dried wheat, and even in dried form it only kept well for a few weeks in damp marching conditions. The fastest news traveled by relay horse, estimated at about 80 kilometers a day, meaning an order from Rome to the frontier could take a whole week, even a month. And transport? A mule could carry only about 90 to 100 kilograms. Sounds fine, until you remember that same mule also had to eat every day. The more mules, the more mouths to feed. The longer the supply train, the more it devoured itself. That was the mathematical trap that strangled every ancient army. Rome answered that trap with a cold-blooded decision. After the reforms of Gaius Marius, around 107 BC, each soldier had to turn himself into a means of transport. Follow a typical legionary. On his shoulders were armor, helmet, shield, food rations for 3 to 15 days, cooking equipment, and a full set of engineering tools, a total of 25 to 30 kilograms, according to researchers' estimates. Contemporaries gave them a nickname that was half joke, half pity: Muli Mariani, Marius's mules. And the central question emerges: why would an empire force its fighting soldiers to double as earth-digging laborers? The answer becomes clear when you place 2 armies side by side. In Caesar's Gallic campaign, the tribal coalitions repeatedly outnumbered the Roman army many times over. But those enormous armies often disintegrated after a few weeks, not because they lost battles, but because they ran out of food. Tens of thousands of brave warriors had to return to their villages simply because no one could feed them. Meanwhile, the far smaller Roman force stood firm for months on enemy soil. The difference was not courage. It was the supply chain, and the shovel was the first link in that chain. So what was it actually used for, every single day? The answer lies in a habit strange to the point of disbelief. Every night, no matter how exhausted, Roman soldiers would build a city. I need to write the next part in Vietnamese, about 3,350 characters, starting from where it left off and going into detail about the Castra pillar with numbers, interesting reveals, a shocking comparison with Hannibal, then moving to the Rhodes pillar, with the figure of 80,000 kilo met, the Via Appia, the conversions, the next reveal, and transitioning to the food supply problem. I will use short sentences, and may add timestamps for this section, 03450730, even though the previous section did not clearly display timestamps. Quite literally. Every afternoon, when the sun was still a few hours from the horizon, the entire legion stopped, not to rest, to dig. According to descriptions by Polybius and later Pseudo-Hyginus, the marching camp the Castra was built following a procedure precise down to the pace. The surrounding ditch was about 1.5 to 3 meters deep. The excavated earth was piled into a rampart on the inside. Atop the rampart were planted sharpened wooden stakes that each soldier had carried on his shoulders throughout the entire day's march. An estimated several thousand men labored for about 2 to 3 hours. The result was a fortress of roughly 15 to 20 hectares for a full legion. Picture it. A plot of land the size of 20 football fields, with walls, a ditch, 4 gates, rising before dark. And the next morning, they abandoned it, moved on, only to build a new one that same afternoon. But here is the secret few people notice. The camp layout was identical everywhere. From misty Britannia to sun-scorched Syria, the main road was always in the same place, the command tent always in the same position, the granary always in the same corner. A new soldier assigned to an unfamiliar camp, in the middle of the night, still knew exactly where his tent was, where the horse stables were. That was process standardizations, something the industrial world would not have a name for until nearly 2,000 years later. The direct consequence. Launching a night raid on an encamped Roman legion was a nearly impossible mission. The enemy was not attacking a group of sleeping men. The enemy was attacking a fortress with sentries rotating in shifts. And here is the comparison that stops many people in their tracks. In 218 BC, Hannibal crossed the Alps into Italy. He crushed the Roman army at Trebia, then created the catastrophe of canny battles still taught in military academies to this day. But throughout 15 years on Italian soil, that genius almost never managed to take Roman positions entrenched behind fortifications. He won in the open field and was powerless before earthen banks lined with wooden stakes. The sword wins the battle, the shovel holds the war, but a strong camp is only half the story. The other half lies beneath the soldier's feet. The Roman Empire, by common estimates, built about 80,000 kilometers of main paved roads and counting secondary roads. Some sources put the total system at over 400,000 kilometers. Those were not trails. They were multi-layered engineering works, a crushed stone foundation, a paved stone surface on top, a road camber so rainwater drained off to both sides on its own. The Via Appia, begun in 312 BC, still has walkable stretches today. A road more than 2,300 years old, more durable than quite a few modern asphalt roads. How does that figure translate into battlefield advantage? On paved roads, a legion moved steadily 25 to 30 kilometers a day, rain or shine, spring or autumn. Meanwhile, on dirt roads in the rainy season, the enemy's ox carts sank to their wheels, virtually standing still, which means Rome was twice as fast as its enemies without a single soldier running any faster. Their speed was not in their legs. It was in the road surface. And the final reveal, perhaps the most surprising. Most of those roads were built by the very soldiers holding shovels, between campaigns, when they were not fighting. The Roman army, in essence, doubled as an enormous infrastructure construction company building roads for its own marches, and for the goods, mail, and taxes of the entire empire to flow. At this point, half the picture is clear. Good roads for speed, solid camps for safe sleep. But those two things only solved movement and defense. There remained a far more brutal problem, the problem that caused countless armies in history to disintegrate without a single battle. How do you feed tens of thousands of stomachs regularly every day on enemy soil? I am drafting the Vietnamese narration script for Pillars 3 and 4, about 3,750 characters, with a fast pace and short sentences, starting from the question of how to feed tens of thousands of stomachs. I will keep the natural text format without timestamps to match the previous section, since the user's request is natural prose rather than a time-marked script. The answer begins with a very small number. Each Roman soldier needed about 1 to 1.5 kilograms of wheat per day, an estimate from Jonathan Roth's research. Sounds like nothing. But multiply it by a legion of 5,000 men, add horses and mules, and the number becomes 6 to 9 tons of food and hay every day, converted for easy visualization. That is 60 to 90 mule loads daily, just for the army to stand still, fighting no one, just to breathe. So how did Rome solve this problem? Reveal number 1. Roman soldiers did not carry bread. They carried whole wheat grain. Why? Bread molds after a few days. Dry grain keeps for months. Each group of 8 men, a contubernum, had its own hand mill, grind it themselves, bake it themselves. The whole army was hundreds of mobile bakeries, and their food stores were nearly immune to time. But the grain still had to be transported. And here is the classic bottleneck of all ancient logistics: The ox pulling the supply cart also has to eat. The farther a supply convoy travels, the more it consumes its own cargo. According to ancient transport cost models, beyond about 100 kilometers overland, hauling grain by ox cart was virtually a losing proposition. By the time the cart arrived, the load was half gone. Rome dodged this blow with water, the most shocking comparison in the entire ancient economy. Transporting 1 ton of goods by boat on rivers or the sea was tens of times cheaper than by land. That is why, looking back at the maps of Rome's major campaigns, you will see them clinging tightly to the Rhine, the Rhone, the Danube. Not by chance. Those were enormous food conveyor belts. Caesar in Gaul ran exactly this playbook, building a chain of granaries along rivers, then compelling allied tribes to deliver wheat according to predetermined quotas. Before drawing his sword, he had already won on the ration spreadsheet. And that system had a specific face, though the histories rarely praise it. The office of Praefectus Castrorum roughly, the legion's logistics director, usually a veteran with 25 to 30 years of experience, risen from the lowest ranks. He was in charge of the camp, the stores, the tools, the medical care. No statue was ever erected for him, but it was he, not the aristocratic general, who determined whether the legion ate or starved. All those puzzle pieces, shovel, roads, granaries, rivers, rations converged at one place, Alesia 52 BC. Vercingetorix and the Gallic forces held out on the hilltop. Caesar, with about 50,000 troops, did not charge. He gave the order to dig 2 rings of fortifications for the siege, one facing inward to block the defenders, one facing outward to block the relief army. Total estimated length of 35 to 40 kilometers, complete with deep ditches, wooden towers, spike traps. Completed in about a month. To visualize, that is digging and building a line of fortifications nearly as long as a marathon course by hand, while a more numerous enemy watched from both sides. The outcome? The enormous relief army outside could not break through the ramparts. Inside, the food stores dwindled. Vercingetorix, the talented, courageous leader, revered by all of Gaul, had to surrender. Not because he lost by the sword, because he ran out of food first. The rawest reveal of the whole story, the most famous siege of Caesar's career, was in essence a contest of digging earth and counting rations. Whichever side dug faster and could eat longer, that side won. Alesia exposes an uncomfortable truth for every heroic epic. The most gifted man on the battlefield can still lose painfully to the one who possesses the better system. Willpower cannot grind wheat. Courage cannot fill a 40-kilometer ditch. And that is the central paradox of the entire Roman story, the one we will confront head-on right now. I'm working on the Vietnamese narration for Part 4, covering the 1115 to 15 time frame. The instructions mention timestamps in the format, but looking at the previous section's style, it seems the prose flows naturally without explicit time markers. So I'll maintain that consistent approach and write the narrative section as continuous prose. That paradox appears most clearly not in a victory, but in a catastrophe. In 9 AD, the Teutoburg Forest, Germania. 3 legions under Varus, an estimated 15 to 20,000 men, were annihilated almost completely. The question posed for 2,000 years, had Roman soldiers gotten worse? No, they were still the same soldiers, but they were pulled out of their system. With no paved roads, the column was forced to stretch out for kilometers through swampy forest, baggage mixed in with fighting men, and most importantly, there was no time to build a proper camp each night. A machine accustomed to running on rails suddenly had to drag itself through mud. Stripped of its infrastructure, the strongest army of the ancient world became as ordinary as any armed mob. The victors at Teutoburg did not defeat the Romans. They defeated the Roman system by not letting it operate. But the paradox has a reverse side, and this side is the truly astonishing one. For centuries, many Roman generals were no geniuses at all. They were mediocre, cautious, even boring. And yet they won consistently. Because the camp was still dug every night, the roads still brought supplies, the granaries were still full, the rations were still distributed. The system ran on autopilot, needing no one exceptional. The most shocking comparison lies here. At Cannae in 216 BC, Rome lost an entire army. Ancient sources estimate 50 to 70,000 casualties in a single day, a blow sufficient to wipe out most nations of that era. Yet just a few years later, Rome had rebuilt its forces. Because the recruitment machine kept turning, the wheat tax kept being collected, The roads kept being built. Meanwhile, Carthage with Hannibal, perhaps the most talented general of antiquity, needed only to lose one fleet to be exhausted. Genius cannot replicate itself, a system can. And then look at that very empire's ending. In the centuries that followed, roads went unmaintained, frontier granaries stood empty. The army grew dependent on mercenaries who shared neither its discipline nor its habits. The last legions still had good swords, good armor, but no one dug the camp each night anymore. No one measured, drove stakes, raised ramparts before sleeping. The empire did not fall for lack of brave men, it never lacked those. It fell because the supply chain broke down gradually, one link at a time, so quietly that no one realized they were witnessing the end. So the final takeaway fits into a single image. The Roman Empire was not built with the blade of the sword. It was built with the blade of the shovel. Whoever delivers the right thing to the right place at the right time wins. The sword wins an afternoon. The shovel wins a century. And that principle has never gone out of date. From modern militaries to today's global supply chains, the lesson remains intact. Enduring systems defeat individual talent, not always spectacular, but almost always true. One necessary note before closing. The numbers you have heard throughout this journey, 25 to 30 kilometers a day, 6 to 9 tons of food a day, 80,000 kilometers of paved roads are estimates synthesized from many sources, from Polybius and Josephus to modern studies such as Jonathan Roth's and contemporary archaeology, and may vary depending on the researcher. But the big picture is consistent. Picture it one last time: an anonymous soldier at the end of a day's march at sunset, driving his shovel into the ground and beginning to dig. No one wrote history about him. No monument bears his name. But that small act, repeated millions of times over hundreds of years, built an empire. And the question left for you, in your own work, what determines success or failure, the moment of brilliance, or the system you repeat every day?